I'm back, part deux. Um, so I mentioned that the single woman on stage would have been an impossibility for English women in reality, right? And it could have been a fantasy for some, um, men and women, right? But it could also have been a nightmare vision for those that had really become, how should we say, committed Protestants, right, who found the Catholic Church to be so abundantly corrupt that the the drawbacks of their own Reformation were perhaps unthought of. Of course, the result of this, the result of shutting shop on the convents and nunneries, um, meant that the the patriarchal order of the time became fundamentally more stringent, right? The suspicion of the suspicion about single women or women's potential to be pious in a manner that excluded them from networks of reproductive futurity, networks of matrimony. Um, that that idea that women could have uh, such a degree of piety as to claim proximity to God more so than men was simply not entertained, right? And it was scoffed at. So I would urge you to remember this as we look at single women, that the vast majority of the English audiences would have found the characters to be problematic simply because they are single. Now, what is a woman to do if she doesn't want to marry? Um, Almost no choices. There are no choices in this regard for the women, right? While prostitution existed, it was not a legal practice, right? And it rendered women's lives and well-being extremely precarious, as is the case even today in most places in the world. Um, the luckiest woman, and I brought this up very briefly in our discussion of Act One of Midsummer Night's Dream when we were in class, the luckiest woman would have been considered the widow in a material sense, keeping in mind that marriages were not about love, were not about forging intimacies between individuals who are aspiring towards a sort of camaraderie of the soul or such things, right? I mean, the early modern mindset about matrimony was practical and pragmatic and economical and political. It was certainly not the wishy-washy stuff that came about in modernity, right? And I don't really mean to disrespect the institution's transformations, but I am drawing attention to the fact that matrimony in the early modern, the Renaissance context was perhaps more transparently honest as an institution about its intentionality, right? It was about accruing wealth, accruing economic, political, cultural security and currency, and it was seen as a trading chip, right? And the trafficable substances in it were the people to be married. Very precisely, women made for great trafficable substance in these alliances. Problematic, absolutely. Transparent, in many ways, much more so than what kind of trafficability of female bodies takes place in matrimony within modernity. So I just wanted to put that out there. The luckiest woman would have been the widow, right? Why? She has been through the marriage rigmarole. and now her husband's dead. She legitimately has, if her marriage had any wealth attached to it, or any properties attached to it, now she legitimately has possession of these properties, or can have legitimate possession of these properties, potentially for the rest of her life, right? Sorry. And this, she could remarry. She could choose not to remarry, and that would make her a single woman with legal status, because she is widowed, not unmarried to begin with financial and economic power. And that would have been, yes, women would have loved, I imagine, to be widowed for that reason, that they could control their own futures and their own economic being, right? This would also have been seen as greatly threatening to the patriarchy, that here is a woman who's legally able to resist all that the larger institutional shapes have done to kind of normatize the silencing, the enforced silencing of women. But if a woman were to kind of delay her marriage, she could come to be, she could come to emulate the status of a single woman for a decent period of time before, the earth caves and marriage happens. And that is where we find Olivia, right? Olivia is a single woman who has found the perfect excuse. I know at least one of you who has commented on the play already has brought up how bizarre it is that Olivia is mourning this ridiculously long period of time for a dead brother, right? And however much one might love a brother, one moves on. That's the kind of common sense idea. And of course that would have been the common sense idea even back then. I'll wait for your comments to arrive before I talk more about this, but the historical possibilities of Olivia's singleness or emulated singleness have to do with the fact that she is now without father and without brother. She is heiress. She is mistress, right? She is essentially the person whose house is being, it's her house, and her guests or her employees, Malvolio works for her, is her steward. A steward is it's a combination of a chartered accountant and a budget officer. So he manages the finances of the house. He is an employee, he is a servant, if you will, but not in the same class as, say, the household help, right? He would have been a very valuable servant, and he would have been respected as such. So that is something I would like you to remember, that the nuance of his profession or his labor. However, she has found the perfect combination, at least, to enjoy this single life, right? So think about how bachelor lives were constructed. You have your own sense of innocence, the sense of delight, the joie de vivre, of living the moment of pleasure, the intimacy between men, as we saw in Othello, that could be lived with without guilt, without a sense of responsibility to the future. All that is available to the bachelor until he gets married. And he has to get married because he must fulfill his responsibilities to the patriarchy by marrying and reproducing, having his progeny imprint upon them his ideologies. And that's how patriarchy propagates itself. But the difference is that once married, the man could resume his intimate bonds with other men without compromising his stance as an individual, as a man, as a patriarch. Women, on the other hand, once married, were, as I have mentioned this repeatedly in class, were required to sever connections from other communities within which they might have citizenship, right? So Hermia and Helena talk about this when we hear that they were like twin cherries and now they are severed because they were twin cherries, friends that could not be separated, but they are separated because of heteronormative eroticism, heteronormative romance, heteronormative performances of those romances, which of course ideally end up in marriage. So for women, marriage meant a sort of permanent erasure of their past intimacies and a permanent erasure of alternative intimacies that could erupt, right? They were locked in, as it were, into being married and into the patriarchal order within which they had to perform the role of wife and mother. Marriage was not desirable to many people as a result. It meant that you had to give up just about everything that you knew and were familiar with and cherished. For a rich woman, and Olivia is certainly that, giving up all this would also mean giving up her role as boss, as controller, if you will, of her own economic domain. That must suck, right? And this is why her mourning becomes this beautiful strategy, a tool that she mobilizes in order to not just ward off matrimony, but to silence. It is the rhetorical device that, I had mentioned in the previous lecture, Elizabeth kind of mobilizes. She uses her melancholia and her filial mourning rituals and rites, RIGHTS and RITES, in order to silence criticism from the most powerful person in Illyria, and that is, of course, Count Orsino. He is the count. So that is one single woman who has figured out what she can do to delay, for as long as is technically possible, the impending, I don't want to dramatize it further than it is already, but the impending doom, if you will, of a patriarchally determined marriage. In Viola's case, the single woman's status is essentially more precarious, essentially more threatening. And in my next lecture, which will be the last one for the day, I will talk about how Viola's single status is a peculiarly, well, maybe not peculiarly, how her single status is urgently threatening, right, to her own self. And we'll talk about why in just a few minutes. I'll see you soon.